podcast all about colour. My name is Helen Disley and I'll be chatting today with Hugh Owens and Steve Westland.
Okay, so this week we're talking about the colour green, and I want to start talking about pigments. One of the earliest green pigments that has been used is malachite, which is a naturally occurring mineral. And it turns out that this was used certainly about 4,000, maybe 5,000 years ago. But there was a massive mine in North Wales. So this is at a place called Llandudno. Now are you from Wales, Hugh? Because you've got a very Welsh-sounding name.
Hugh?
Well, both my parents are we're definitely Welsh, yeah.
So can you pronounce Llandudno better than me?
Llandudno, probably.
Yeah, that's right, yeah. That sounds good. Yeah, it's pronounced with a C, isn't it? But yeah, Llandudno, I call it. And there they've got a very large hill called the Great Orme. And in 1987 they were doing some development work on it. And they discovered an underground series of tunnels and mines. And when they excavated it, and they haven't excavated all of it yet, but when they excavated lots of it, they discovered that it was actually the world's largest prehistoric mine. Anywhere in the world. And it was basically there for at least 4,000 years doing this. And what they were mining was copper and copper minerals, and one of the things that they were finding was malachite. So it was one of the sources for this pigment. Malachite was actually North Wales. And the other really ancient pigment I've come across is the aptly named ancient green earth, which is just a sort of naturally occurring mineral in the ground. Actually not very green, it's very weakly green coloured. But it was used, I mean, they found it, for example, on the walls in Pompeii. So when was that? Vesuvius, it's about 2,000 years ago, wasn't it, Vesuvius erupted? So that probably means they were using it on the walls, probably as egg tempera frescoes on the walls, probably at least 2,000 to 3,000 years ago. Do either of you guys have any other old, ancient green pigments to talk about?
The only one I can think of, I'm not, unless it's the same as what you just mentioned, is verdigris, which the Romans used, where I think they soaked copper plates in wine, and it produced a sort of green colour that we see now. If any kind of copper sort of plant pots and things will eventually get this sort of verdigris colour. And I think it was used by Romans, and also medieval monks used that in illuminated manuscripts.
Yeah, I've heard of that. It's not the same as malachite. I think malachite's a mineral, whereas I think verdigris is like an oxide of copper.
Yeah.
It's probably a little bit more complicated than just simply copper oxide, but it's an oxide of copper. Anything for you, Hugh, on the old ancient mineral front?
Expert.
Yes. Mm. So I've read that green, I mean, we talked last week, by the way, about some of the yellow pigments being poisonous, but I think green has the reputation as being the most poisonous of all the pigments. And a lot of this is to do with I think it's pronounced Scheele's green. It could be Scheele's green, but I think it's Scheele's green,
Yeah.
which was Scheele was a Swedish chemist in 1775. He made a green pigment, and the ingredients were copper sulfate, sodium carbonate, and arsenious oxide. That should already be making people feel nervous, because that sounds very much like arsenic, which of course it was. And apparently one of the main ingredients of this green pigment was copper arsenide, and that's one of the deadliest compounds ever discovered. And yet this new green pigment, which is a really bright green, could be made very cheaply, was used on children's toys, on paints, on wallpaper. It was even used for sweets or candy, as the Americans call it. Yet it was incredibly poisonous, causing all sorts of problems, including cancer. And some people actually say it even killed Napoleon, because apparently after he lost his battle at Waterloo, which of course I'm going to edit this out, it's a great time to bring in ABBA's Waterloo song, just for you two guys. After that, he went into exile, of course, in St Helena in 1815, and he stayed in a room painted with his favourite colour, green. And 6 years later, he died of stomach cancer. And some people think it's quite possible that this could have been caused by the Scheele's green, because apparently when it's used in wallpaper, for example, and it starts to become a little bit humid and warm, it can give off a poisonous gas. And it was replaced eventually by Paris green in the late 1800s. But that wasn't very much less poisonous than Scheele's green. And Paris green is used extensively by people like Monet and Cézanne. And in fact, some people say it could have even been the cause of Monet going blind. And the thing I find surprising of all of this is, when was it banned? When was it finally banned? Do you know?
I know this. In the 1960s.
Yeah, exactly. I find that incredible, don't you think?
Yeah.
It's still being used in the UK, for example, and elsewhere, in the 1940s, in the 1950s.
Although even though a lot of current green pigments still have some quite nasty chemicals in them, don't they? It's just still a problem, even with modern pigments. A lot of chlorine-based bromides and things. That's not good.
Yeah, I've been doing some work recently with a paint standards organisation where they're looking to reproduce some paint standards which go back to the 1950s. And the strange thing is, in some cases we can't make those colours, because some of those really bright colours that were in use in the 1950s are now banned, and the modern equivalents just aren't as good in colour terms. You find that quite a lot.
In the 15th century, the devil was depicted as being green.
No, that's right. So if we think about all of the sort of the negative associations of green, you've got things like, the Wicked, the musical based on what's it called?
Wizard of Oz.
Wizard of Oz.
Yeah. So there was actually a painting by Michael Patcher in the 1470s. I think that's the one you're talking about, Hugh. And he depicted the devil dressed entirely in green. And apparently Chaucer also depicted the devil in green in his Friar's Tale. And I actually found a paper, a very nicely named paper. It's called Why the Devil Wears Green, written in 1954 in Modern Language Notes. And it suggested that the devil was represented as green in Chaucer's story, and then probably also in Michael Patcher's painting. to connect him to the Celtic otherworld. And this is a mythical realm where gods lived, Celtic gods. Because we hear a lot about the Norse gods, don't we, and the Greek gods.
Yeah.
I don't know very much about the Celtic gods, but they lived in the Celtic otherworld. Possibly undead people live there too, or indeed live there too, if it exists. And the same place apparently is called Avalon in legends about King Arthur, and is an island called Avalon in some of the Marvel universe stuff that goes on. So it makes me think I'd quite like to read more about the Celtic mythology and the Celtic gods. I don't know very much about it, but yeah. So then you have to start saying, well, how did the colour green become associated with the Celts anyway, and with Ireland in particular? So we're all, I mean, nobody can fail to notice the amount of green that you see on St. Patrick's Day. You know, it's all green, isn't it? And the shamrocks and everything.
Yeah.
It turns out that St. Patrick used a shamrock to teach the Irish about the Trinity. This is about the 5th century. But interestingly, originally, St. Patrick was associated with the colour blue. And his order, the Order of St. Patrick, there was actually a colour they wore called St. Patrick's Blue. Later, he became associated with green, and from what I can make out, this is probably connected with the Emerald Isle. So, you know, green became associated with Ireland at some point, and then became associated with St. Patrick. There was actually, the earliest reference I found, funnily enough, was a poem in 1795 by William Drennan, and it had these two lines: "The cause it is good, and the men they are true, and the green shall outlive both the orange and the blue." The orange, of course, are the Protestants, and the blue are the Roman Catholics. So I still got a few pieces to knit together there, because the earliest reference I can find to the Emerald Isle is that poem by William Drennan, and yet obviously the painting Hugh referred to predates that, and Chaucer clearly predates that. So it's still not entirely clear to me when and exactly how green became so associated with Ireland, with Celtic mythology.
Because there's also the Green Man, isn't there, as a sort of a mythical figure. He's not not evil, but he's not nice. He's not a nice character. I don't know if that's related in some way to the devil. And
you're not talking about the Green Lantern, are you? That's a Marvel thing.
No.
That's the only thing I know. What's this Green Man thing, Helen?
But there's a lot of ancient culture about the Green Man. I don't know if it goes back to medieval times, but certainly 200-300 years going back. He's this sort of figure in carvings on churches and things that you'll see. But it's also associated with the horned god, you know, the pagan deity. So even though it's very nature and lots of sort of flowers and wrapped in ivy and things, I don't think it's necessarily a good. I don't think he's necessarily always seen as a wholesome figure, which is why I wondered about the devil reference.
A bit like Tom Bombadil in Lord of the Rings. Generally a good figure,
not always,
but not always entirely wholesome. No, it's true.
I think green is still the national colour of Ireland, though, isn't it? I think all of their sports teams tend to play in green. It is.
It absolutely is. So you know, it's long associated with Ireland. The question is exactly when and how did it become associated with Ireland? I think is the issue. It's also associated with loads of Muslim countries, if you look at almost every Muslim country has green in their flag. And that's because green is strongly associated with Muhammad. Very, very strongly. Yeah. And associated with happiness and fertility in Asia. You know, the green man,
Yeah.
you know, I'm not saying it's an Asian construct, but it could have links to fertility there also in the West, Helen.
Yeah, I think I've read somewhere that green had been long associated with fertility and was once a preferred colour choice for wedding gowns up to sort of the 1400s.
It's very unlucky colour now, isn't it, for weddings? Yeah.
And green's also really strongly associated with the evil and the supernatural. You know, there's that green devil. But a lot of people think some of this is attributed to The Wizard of Oz. You know, it's one of the really iconic films where colour was used, and the green Wicked Witch of the was it the West or the East? I don't remember. There was two of them, wasn't there?
East, I think.
Yeah, which one died when the house fell on
Wicked
her?
Witch of the East.
Is that the one which one died when the house fell on her? Was it the? Yeah, I don't know.
Galinda was the Good Witch of the North. That's all I can remember.
Who was the Witch of the South? We never met them, did we?
We never met her. Perhaps for a sequel.
Or novel. There's a novel there for somebody. But yeah, I think of the witch with the green face, whichever one it was, the Wicked Witch. Really iconic. And even the Emerald City, if it was called that, where the wizard lived, was somewhat unwholesome in the end, wasn't it?
Mm. Yeah.
But I don't know whether you know this story, Helen, because Helen and I are brother and sister, of course. My mother, also Helen's mother, told me a story once. She worked as an usherette in a cinema when she was young.
Yeah.
And she'd never seen a colour movie. This is in the 1940s. And everyone heard that the movie coming next week was The Wizard of Oz. And the excitement, can you imagine the excitement? The Wizard of Oz is coming. And so she remembers the first time it was shown. And if anyone is familiar with the movie, it starts off in Kansas in black and white.
Yeah.
And she said everybody was squinting at the screen. 'Cause they were used to that sort of sepia type footage you used to get. Sort of, this is artificially coloured, all one colour with a wash. They're looking at this black and white footage, thinking, is it coloured?
Is it
I
me?
I thought it'd be better than that, you know. And then,
Is there a hint of colour in the corner there? Yeah.
yes, you can imagine when suddenly they landed in Oz.
She opens the door,
Yeah,
doesn't
and
she?
it's the really bright colours of that process in particular was very, very colourful. Bright, I can still see it now. The bright yellow, the yellow brick road, and everything. Can you imagine the gasps in the cinema as everyone saw for the first time?
It's actually a really clever trick they
Yes.
did there, wasn't it? To start it in black and white rather than just straight in with the colour, and everyone's like, "Oh."
It's
Very
still
clever.
a movie I really like to watch, to be honest.
Mm.
And I went, I think it was last year or a year ago, 2 years ago, in Leeds. I went to the theatre to see a play of The Wizard of Oz. It was absolutely fantastic. Though my son was less than impressed. I think people these days, because there's so much entertainment and they're used to all these colour screens and everything, it takes more to...
Yeah.
He basically said to me, in the words of Shania Twain, that don't impress me much. But I loved it. I loved it. It was for kids. It was great.
Yeah.
I suppose that the only thing that we can relate that back to is probably something like Avatar, when Avatar first came out. And it was the first large-scale movie production in 3D. And I think that really dragged people out because it was so different to their multimedia experiences at home.
Mm. There are some really clever uses of colour in movies. Like, have you seen Pleasantville? It starts off, the whole movie again starts off in black and white, and I can't remember the full story of it, but as corruption appears and comes into the movie, things start to become coloured gradually during the movie. Yeah, I teach a module at this time of year, and students have to write an essay about any aspect of colour, actually. And quite a lot of the students are students of media, and some of them choose to write about the use of colour in movies. And I always enjoy reading these essays in particular, so there's loads of... I think Sin City is another one where colour's being used really effectively. But if you look at a lot of movies, they use colour really cleverly to create the scene or the emotion, and often use complementary colours side by side really dramatically. I really enjoy looking at the way that colour's used in movies.
There was the one with, I think, Warren Beatty, and I can't remember what it was called, but it was all done in primary colours. It's kind of a gangster type film. Can't remember the name. But a lot of red and green primarily.
Yeah, there was a very bright green of that character. What was it called?
That's a spicy meatball!
The Mask.
The Mask. Yes. That was also very vivid green, wasn't it? And also playing the sort of the unpleasant character, wasn't he?
The Grinch.
He was green.
It's strange, isn't it? You have very positive associations with these colours, but also very negative associations. So it's often a symbol of sickness. So you'll often see in cartoons...
But a symbol of health as well.
Well, yeah. You'll see a character having a green face in a cartoon when they're not very well. The one that really bugs me, I have to say, is the green-eyed monster from Othello. You know, the green-eyed monster which doth mock. Now, for somebody with green eyes, like I have, that's never sat well with me.
So I was reading something about green eyes, that it isn't actually a green pigment, that it's some combination of browns and yellows and some refraction of the light, which is really interesting. Special.
We should do an episode on eye colour.
Yeah,
there's quite a lot to it.
It is quite complicated. At a first approximation, you can say that there are two eye colours. There's blue, which is not caused by a pigment; it's just caused by scattering of the structure within the eye. And then there's brown, which is caused by melanin, I guess.
Oh, okay.
And then various amounts of melanin give you all shades between blue and brown. But as Hugh says, there is more to it, because there are some other pigments, and I think green, there may be a contributing factor there. I'm not sure, but there are some unusual pigments that sometimes do occur. It isn't just melanin, I don't think.
No, you're absolutely right, and there are several different pigments that are at play, but also there's structural colour as well. So people with grey eyes, that's to do with the material that makes up the iris. So it is quite an interesting
So we can have an episode on just colour of eyes, I think. Or actually,
we could quite easily. And again, quite interestingly, it was always thought of in quite simple ways, in that the eye colour was going to be held on one of the chromosomes. But very recently, they've just come out with another 50 genes they've found that are responsible for eye colour. Even now. So I remember when I first started studying in this area with Steve a long time ago, that according to those theories, it was very unlikely for me to have green eyes. But now they've progressed on, and it does make more sense.
So I can understand a little bit how. I suppose green with envy. The idea of green with sickness makes a bit of sense, because remember we talked before about the blue, people's blue face when you can't breathe, and if you're feeling sick, you do go a little bit green, don't you? And I can see where that comes from. Do you think that's the root cause of green with envy here, or is there something else?
I'm not sure. I mean, the green thing in health, I think, is supposed to be this build-up of bile in your body. There's
there was green bile, wasn't there? Yeah.
With it.
There was yellow bile and green bile.
Yeah. Green with envy. I'm not sure where that comes from, but you can see it's been used through the ages. You know, Shakespeare obviously used it, but it's also been traced back, I think, even further to the ancient Greeks used to think that green was associated with jealousy, and this idea of the overproduction of bile, as you say, which should turn your skin slightly green.
So this idea, we've mentioned it in many podcasts, that pretty much all the colours have got both positive and negative associations, and it's very much the case with green, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, things like green shoots of recovery, it's pretty obvious where that comes from, I think. It's pretty literal. And green behind the ears is probably connected with that. Green behind the ears, it means, a little bit undeveloped,
naive,
naive, sort of just
youth, yeah.
Just a few shoots. One other thing I wanted to mention was the Statue of Liberty. So it's a really iconic building. In fact, if someone said to people, list some famous green buildings, I suspect that might be one of them that they would list, the Statue of Liberty. But as you two probably know...
Short list of one for me.
Yeah, well... yeah. To be honest, I'm struggling as well. I can picture a few places with green domes. That's quite common, wasn't it, on old buildings? But I couldn't name any off the top of my head. So yeah, maybe it is. So it was originally brown, and I've seen postcards that have been made of it at the time where it's just completely brown. It was made of copper. It was never intended to be green, and it was basically opened up in 1886. 20 years later, by 1906, it was already green. So apparently a very complicated reaction that can take a couple of decades with the right sort of chemicals in the air, the right weather conditions and humidity, creates various oxides of copper which are green. And at the time, the army were in control, the US Army were in control of the Statue of Liberty because it was of the island it was constructed on, which they controlled. And people said, what should we do about it? It's changed colour. And there was actually a plan to paint it, believe it or not. Paint it back brown, which would have been horrendous, of course.
Well, actually, I was going to ask if they made any attempt to, revert it back.
Well,
or
they talked about it in the early 1900s, but when the public found out about it, they were already in love with the sort of the green statues. Everyone was really against. It was like a public backlash against the idea of painting it. So it's no attempt has ever actually been made to reverse its colour. And I've also read somewhere that this layer of copper oxide has a very good chance of making it last a very long time. There's lots of copper statues have lasted a very long time down the ages because of this process. Once it's formed, it's pretty impervious.
It's really interesting.
We talk about the blue planet, don't we? And I wrote a book chapter recently, and I put the picture, which is the first picture ever captured of the Earth.
Yeah.
I think it's called
that little dot.
It's called the blue something.
The blue dot, is it?
It's not called the blue Earth. It's called something. The blue something. But it basically that was a really important image, and it's almost kick-started the environmental movement, because it made people realise how small and insignificant, but also how everything was connected together on this one tiny little planet. But the point is, it might have even been called the blue marble. I can't remember. It was basically blue. So we think of the Earth as being blue, and that's because most of the Earth is water, of course. But if you're walking around on the Earth, on land, you'd probably say green is the colour. I mean, green is the colour of life, isn't it? And we haven't talked very much about things like the Green Movement and the Green Party. But it's fairly obvious, isn't it, where that association comes from?
Absolutely.
Though I do, it's often associated with being environmentally friendly. The colour green, but if you notice, you often get packaging these days, and that packaging is not green. It's normally brown, if you notice, and brown is sort of often the colour of packaging. It's because it looks almost unprocessed, as if maybe it hasn't had any artificial dye or pigment added to it. But it has that sort of natural look, doesn't it, brown, for things like packaging. Yeah. So brown's often used rather than green because green has this, it does have this really, this association with life, but also with toxicity. If you were making a cartoon or something about a toxic barrel of toxic waste, what colour would it be? Probably luminous green.
Yeah. Or a bottle of poison, or it's always green, isn't it? Yeah.
Although it is associated with the Green Movement and the Green Party, it's not universally a colour that's always associated with health or with good things. Unlike us,
I think yes,
we're always
indeed
associated with good things.
It is funny. It is often associated with wealth and prosperity. You can think of talking about the green being money, perhaps in the US, or jade in China, for instance.
Emerald.
So that there are, absolutely. And I think we've talked about behaviour before, haven't we?
Yeah.
And green seems to be a very calming colour. I know that there was. They painted one of the bridges down in London. Was it Blackfriars Bridge?
Yeah,
they painted that green,
yeah.
and they saw suicides drop by about a third from that bridge.
Wow.
So it definitely has a very calming influence on us. But I think there are so many different shades of green.
Well, that's right. So you take the luminous green. That always looks almost toxicity, doesn't it?
Yes.
But
yellow green isn't nice.
A bit sick,
Yeah. So we associate that with it not being very healthy, as you say. But whereas a vibrant green of new foliage or something like that, and I think we're very good at discerning different levels of green. I think it's one of the reasons we tend to use that in things like night vision scopes. They always tend to be green, don't they? You're looking at different levels of green.
Yeah, I wonder if that's, just thinking back to that, was it one of the very first podcasts we did about this, where you mentioned a tribe, Steve, and they were able to differentiate
the Himba tribe,
a huge range of green colour. But whether it's because of where it is in the spectrum or because there is so much green in our lives. that we were able to differentiate.
I remember when I first started my PhD, because I often say to people, how many colours are there, and they say things like 16 million. And they say that because their computer can display 16 million colours. And I say, well, actually, when I started, my computer could only generate 2, green and black. And by the way, I have one in my lab that can generate. I have one in my lab that can generate 1 billion. So that's just about technology. But if I think back, my original computer, they were green. Hugh might remember. He's not that old, but he's probably seen old footage of old people doing things with this. The old
I think I've
computer.
seen footage of you using an old computer. Yeah.
And things like an oscilloscope. It's green, isn't it? And then you say night vision goggles are green. And what I don't know is whether that's, if you think about those oscilloscopes and those old computer screens, is that because they were the easiest colours they could reproduce? Because certainly in the early days, for example, you couldn't make things like blue LEDs. They became much later. Or is it they were designed that way because green's right in the middle of the spectrum, so in terms of intensity, it's the colour we're most sensitive to. Whereas
I think it's more to do with perceptual levels. Obviously, you've got two overlapping cones in that area, haven't you?
So we're much more sensitive in that middle region. If you look at the very short wavelengths and the very long wavelengths, we're not very sensitive to. I should clarify, when we talk about sensitivity, we're not talking about hue sensitivity, which is whether you can distinguish one hue from another, but intensity sensitivity, which is how bright does it need to be in order to see it.
Yeah.
And we're not very sensitive at the far ends, at the blue and the red, because you've only got one cone and it's the tail end of it anyway. In the middle of the spectrum, it's where we're most sensitive, so it does make sense for things. If you're going to have something which is a little bit coloured, make it green. It just makes sense.
It does make sense as well because, if you think about it, if you don't want to mess with your nighttime vision, then you'd use something in the red, which is well away from that scotopic peak, that nighttime vision peak. And you see that, don't you, when we used to look at developing photographs. There'd be a red room. You'd go into a room with a red light, and that would retain your vision then, your nighttime vision. So obviously there's an advantage to having night goggles in that central portion of the visible spectrum.
So for the last 4 weeks we've talked about, I think, red, yellow, blue and green. And there's a reason for picking those 4 colours. There's lots of logos. If you look at logos that use 4 colours, and I'm thinking, for example, of Google and Microsoft. They're 2 of the most iconic logos. Look at their colours: red, yellow, green, blue. And part of the reason for that is there's a sort of saliency with those colours because they are the 4 psychological primaries. So we can talk about the sort of the additive primaries, or red, green, and blue, and the subtractive primaries. You can argue about whether it's cyan, magenta, and yellow, which I would argue, or you might argue it's red, yellow, and blue. But then there's the psychological primaries. I think Hugh referred to the work of Herring, I think, the psychologist, many years ago. There are 4 psychological primaries, and these particular 4 colours have a very important property in that we say that they're unique. And what that means is, if you can see reds, and some reds are a little bit yellower, and some reds are a little bit bluer than others, but there is a red which looks just like a pure red, and there's a yellow that looks like a pure yellow, and a green and a blue. But there's no orange that's unique. So, for example, orange always looks like a mixture of red and yellow, and purple always looks like a mixture of red and blue. So we've tackled these 4 colours first because they are probably more important in some way: red, yellow, green, and blue. So next time, if we carry on doing these colours, maybe it's going to be white, maybe it's going to be black. Who knows? We don't know. That's for sure. We'll probably decide Thursday morning next week or whenever we record the next podcast. But I hope people enjoyed listening to that. Stories about green. We haven't got a title yet. The colour of... what? The colour of what?
Life.
So one thing I like about you, Helen, is you always think of something nice. Like whenever we talk the colour of life, right? So
Yeah.
I was thinking of
Very positive.
I was thinking of the colour of evil, or the colour of.
Well, what does that say about you?
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. What do you think? You can have the deciding vote. What do you think of you? The colour of.
Helen's always right. We know that.
Yeah, of course.
Okay, we'll do life. It is actually associated with life in many Asian countries actually, and as you say, it is a colour of fertility here. So I think we can get away with it. So okay, thank you very much everyone for listening, and we'll see you next week with our next colour, whatever that is. Bye for now. Bye.
Bye. Thanks for listening.